Wyoming Territory, October 1878. The woman was half dead under a cottonwood tree when the widow found her. Pearl Foster pulled back hard on the reins, her mare kicking up dust as she stopped. The shape under the tree barely looked human, just a crumpled figure in torn trousers and a bloodied shirt, one boot missing, hair stuck to her face with dried blood and sweat. Pearl swung down without thinking, rifle slung across her back, coat flapping in the wind. The plains stretched empty behind her, the sun dipping low over the distant bighorns. She knelt beside the woman, pressing 2 fingers to her throat, alive. Barely. "Hey," Pearl said, voice low, steady. "Can you hear me?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came. Pearl shrugged off her own coat, a thick wool thing lined with faded elk hide. She wrapped it around the woman's shoulders, then reached to her belt and unbuckled the Colt nestled there. She pressed it into the woman's palm. "You hold this tight," she said. "If someone comes before I get back with water, you shoot. Understand?" The woman blinked once. Her fingers clenched weakly around the grip. Pearl ran. The creek was a 1/4 mile east. She filled her canteen, soaked a rag, and ran back. Each time she looked up, she expected to see someone, whoever had done this to the woman coming over the ridge. But the land stayed quiet, the wind brushing through the dry grass like a whisper. By the time Pearl returned, the woman had managed to sit up, leaning against the tree trunk. Her hands shook as she took the water, but she drank. Pearl crouched beside her again. "What's your name?" The woman cleared her throat, voice hoarse and cracked. "Emmett." Pearl blinked. She had expected a different kind of name. Emmett's eyes found hers, sharp even in the fading light. "I know." "It's strange." Pearl gave a small nod. "Pearl Foster. My place is east, near the edge of the basin. Can you ride?" Emmett tried to stand. She made it halfway before her knees buckled. Pearl caught her. "No," Emmett muttered. "Guess not." Pearl helped her into the saddle and walked the mare home, holding Emmett steady with one hand. It took 2 hours to get back. The sun was gone by the time they reached the cabin, small, sturdy, set against a grove of wind-warped pines. Smoke curled from the chimney. A soft yellow light glowed behind the windows. Inside, Pearl eased Emmett onto the cot near the hearth. The fire was already going. She fetched clean water, stitched the worst of the cuts, and wrapped Emmett's ribs. There was a long gash on her thigh that looked like it had come from a knife. Pearl did not ask what had happened. Not yet. Later, after Emmett had eaten half a tin of beans and fallen asleep, Pearl sat at the edge of the bed and watched her. She looked young, maybe 25. That was not much younger than Pearl herself. She had seen plenty of violence in the last few years. Her husband, Will, had been gunned down by a horse thief outside Casper. That was 4 years ago. Their 2 children, both under 5, had taken sick the winter after that. The fever had come quick and left the house quieter than Pearl could stand. She had not been much for talking since. But when she looked at Emmett, bruised, bloodied, breathing soft against the pillow, something unfamiliar stirred in her chest. She did not sleep that night. Not fully. Every creak of the wind made her reach for her rifle. By morning, Emmett was awake and alert, her eyes scanning the cabin like she was still waiting for someone to come through the door. Pearl handed her a cup of coffee. "You remember anything else?" Emmett nodded slowly. "Bandits." "Thought I had gold." She looked down at her hands. "I did not." Pearl leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. She did not press her. Instead, she watched her move, slow, careful, but with a quiet strength that Pearl recognized. "You got family?" Pearl asked. "No," Emmett said. "No one left." Pearl nodded once. She knew what that looked like. The next few days passed in silence, mostly. Emmett slept, recovered, moved a little more each morning. Pearl fed the hens, chopped wood, rode out to check the trapline. When she came back in the evenings, Emmett was always near the fire, flipping through one of the few books Will had left behind. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow whispered against the windows, Emmett said, "You did not have to help me." Pearl looked up from where she was mending a torn sleeve. "I know," she said. Emmett's voice was quiet. Why did you? Pearl met her eyes. Because I have been where you were, and someone left me under a tree too. Emmett watched her for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you." Pearl just nodded and went back to her stitching, but her hands trembled. By the end of the second week, Emmett had her strength back. She walked without pain, helped Pearl with firewood, even rode out with her once to check the traps. She carried the Colt now, tucked into her belt like it belonged there. "You could head south," Pearl said one morning. "Fort Laramie's always hiring scouts." Emmett looked out over the snow-covered basin. "I could," but she did not. Instead, she stayed. They fell into a rhythm, easy and quiet. Pearl never asked her to stay. Emmett never said she would. But each evening, when the lamps were lit and the fire cracked and popped, they found themselves sitting close, hands brushing just barely as they passed a tin cup or a slice of bread. One night, Pearl reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind Emmett's ear. Emmett caught her wrist, held it there for a second longer than needed. Pearl's voice was low. "I did not think I would feel anything again." Emmett looked at her, eyes soft. "Me neither." Pearl leaned in, heartbeat loud in her ears. Emmett met her halfway. When their lips touched, it was not rushed. It was quiet and certain, like the land around them steady, unmovable, true. Pearl pulled back just enough to whisper, "You can stay if you want." Emmett's eyes searched hers. "I want." Outside, the wind picked up, but inside, everything was still. Pearl let herself breathe again. For the first time in years, it did not ache. The days shortened fast that November, the sun slipping behind the pines before supper and the wind picking up sharp off the basin. Pearl had started banking the fire higher come dusk, and Emmett had taken to chopping kindling without being asked. Neither of them said much about the way they moved around each other now closer. Easy, like they'd been doing it for years instead of weeks, but the silence between them had changed. It held warmth now, not distance. Pearl was up early most mornings, but one frostbitten dawn, she woke to the sound of someone outside splitting wood. Through the frosted window, she saw Emmett at the stump, sleeves rolled up, her breath white as smoke. She moved with practiced rhythm, like she had done it 1,000 times before. When Emmett came back inside, her cheeks were ruddy and her hands pink from the cold. "You ever work a line camp?" Pearl asked, handing her a steaming tin of coffee. "Couple winters down along the Green River," Emmett said, "before the trouble started." Pearl didn't ask what kind of trouble, not yet. Instead, she nodded toward the stove. "You keep swinging like that, I'll have to build a second shed." Emmett smiled at that, quiet and genuine. "Might be the first time someone's been glad to have me underfoot." Pearl poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter. "You're not underfoot." Later that week, the trapline brought in 2 rabbits and a half-frozen fox. Emmett skinned them clean without comment, her hands sure. Pearl watched from the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, and said, "You learned that from your father." Emmett didn't look up. "Older brother. He ran off to Nevada after the war, chasing silver. Heard he got shot in a saloon over a bottle of rye." Pearl stepped down into the yard, the snow crunching under her boots. "I never had a brother, just 2 sisters. One got married young and the other never came back from Fort Phil Kearny." Emmett's hands paused over the pelt. "There's a lot of ghosts between here and the fort." Pearl nodded slowly. "There are." They didn't speak again till the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Pearl walked beside Emmett as they brought the pelts to the shed, neither saying much, but their steps fell into rhythm just the same. That night, Emmett unfolded a scrap of paper from her satchel, creased and soft from wear. Pearl didn't ask, but Emmett offered it anyway. "My mother's handwriting," she said. "Recipe for vinegar pie. She used to make it when we couldn't afford fruit." Pearl held the paper like it might tear apart in her hands. "You remember how it goes?" "Well enough." They baked it together, the little kitchen filled with the smell of nutmeg and scorched sugar. Pearl watched the way Emmett moved, careful, deliberate, but not afraid to laugh when the crust burned along one edge. The pie came out lopsided and sweet and better than anything Pearl had tasted since before the war. After they sat on the floor beside the fire, the pie tin between them, boots off, shoulders touching. "You think you'll ever leave here?" Emmett asked, her eyes on the flames. Pearl reached for another bite before answering. "I used to think I would, that this place was just something to survive. And now," Pearl met her gaze, "now I think maybe it's something to keep." Emmett's hand brushed hers, then settled there. "I never stayed anywhere longer than a season." "Never had reason to." Pearl didn't pull away. "You might now." Neither of them moved for a long time. When the fire burned low and the coals glowed soft, Emmett leaned in and brushed her lips against Pearl's cheek light, careful, like a question. Pearl turned into it, answering without words. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The wind whistled through the pines, the pie tin lay empty, and the fire kept burning. A late November storm rolled in with little warning, thick-bellied clouds pressing low and dark over the foothills, the wind rising sharp through the pines before noon. By mid-afternoon, snow had started falling in heavy, wet sheets that clung to everything and turned the yard into a sea of white. Pearl barred the door and banked the fire high while Emmett hauled the last of the split wood inside. The storm muffled the world outside, the silence deep and strange, broken only by the hiss of snow against the windows. By evening, the drifts had swallowed the porch steps, and the two women sat at the table with the oil lamp casting a soft circle of light. Pearl worked a patch into a wool sock, and Emmett sharpened a broken-bladed skinning knife she'd found beneath the floorboards of the shed. "You ever been through one this early?" Emmett asked, testing the edge with her thumb. Pearl glanced toward the window, where the world had turned white and featureless. "Once. Winter of '71, lost 3 cows and near lost the barn roof." Emmett rested her hands on the table's edge. "What you do?" "Built a trench from the house to the barn with sacks and hay. Hauled water in buckets through snow waist deep. Will was alive then. We made it through." Pearl hadn't spoken his name aloud in months. It didn't sting like it used to. She met Emmett's eyes. "Hardest part was the quiet. You start hearing things that aren't there." Emmett nodded. "That's the kind of quiet stays with you, like it settles in your bones." Outside, something thumped against the side of the cabin, not loud, just enough to pull both their eyes to the wall. Pearl stood, picked up the rifle from behind the door, and stepped onto the porch. The wind was shrieking now, snow swirling so thick she could barely see past the edge of the roof. She held still, listening, nothing but the storm. Back inside, Emmett had already laid another log on the fire. "Could have been a branch," she said, though her fingers were curled around the knife's handle. Pearl locked the door behind her. "Could have been." They didn't speak again for a while. The storm pressed in heavier, the windows frosting over. At some point, Emmett stretched her legs out under the table and her foot brushed Pearl's. Neither of them moved it away. Pearl's voice was quiet. "That knife, you had it when I found you." "No," Emmett said. "It was theirs, one of the men. I kept it after." Pearl didn't ask how. "I figured," Emmett went on, "if I didn't make it, someone might find me with a weapon in hand. Seemed better than nothing." Pearl reached across the table, laid her fingers lightly on Emmett's wrist. "You made it." Emmett turned her hand over to hold hers. The lamp guttered briefly, wind rattling the shutters, then stillness again. Pearl stood and crossed to the hearth. She pulled a wool blanket from the chair and laid it out before the fire. "We'll sleep here tonight," she said, "in case the roof strains." Emmett nodded. She unbuckled her belt and folded her coat nearby, then settled beside Pearl on the blanket. They lay on their backs, side by side, the firelight flickering across the rafters above. After a while, Emmett spoke into the quiet. "I used to think I'd end up dying in some alley or gulch. Never thought I'd see winter with someone who cared if I didn't." Pearl turned her head. "You'll see spring, too, if I have anything to do with it." Emmett smiled, but it wasn't a light thing. It was quiet and real and carried weight. They lay there until the fire burned down to embers, the storm raging outside, but the warmth between them steady and sure. When Pearl reached for Emmett's hand beneath the blanket, Emmett laced their fingers together without hesitation. No words followed. None were needed. The storm would pass. The snow would melt. But what they'd found, shelter, steadiness, a place to belong, had already taken root, quiet and deep, beneath the frozen ground. By early December, the snow had hardened into a crusted shell across the basin. The storms had passed, but the cold had settled in for good. The cabin stood quiet and solid against the wind, smoke curling from the chimney, the pine trees creaking like old bones in the stillness. Emmett had taken to waking first, coaxing the fire from its sleep with slow hands and care. Pearl would find her already dressed, the coffee heating and her hair pulled back with a strip of leather she'd cut from an old saddlebag. They didn't speak much in the mornings, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them had turned companionable, like a well-worn coat. That morning, Pearl stepped outside to find Emmett crouched beside the fence, running her fingers along the bottom rail. A set of narrow tracks crossed through the fresh powder. "Coyote?" Pearl asked, tugging her shawl tight at her throat. "Too light," Emmett said. "Maybe a fox." "Might be worth setting a snare," Pearl nodded. "You want the wire, I can find it," Emmett said, standing. "You want me to check the barn?" Pearl hesitated. "That mare's favoring her back leg, might be an abscess." "If you've the stomach for it, I could use help draining it." Emmett gave a short nod. "I've done worse." Later, with the mare tied off and steaming in the cold, Pearl steadied her while Emmett crouched low, working the hoof knife with steady pressure. Pearl kept her hand on the horse's jaw, murmuring low, her breath fogging the air. When the pus drained out in a slow, foul stream, neither woman flinched. "Won't be walking well for a few days," Emmett said, wiping her hands on a rag. "But she'll keep it." Pearl nodded, watching the mare shift her weight with cautious relief. "You've done that before." "A trader once offered me $1 to clean out a mule's hoof," Emmett said. "I was 15 and hungry. Took the $1, kept the mule." Pearl let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "You always this practical." "Only when I'm not scared." Pearl turned. "You scared now?" Emmett didn't look away. "Not of you." They walked back to the house with the sky pale and flat above them. Inside, the kettle sang low, and the scent of juniper still clung to Pearl's sleeves from the branches she'd cut days before. Emmett poured them each a cup and leaned against the table. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked. "I did once," Pearl said. "Right after the children passed. I thought maybe I could start again somewhere no one knew me." "What stopped you?" Pearl took a sip, let the heat settle in her chest. "I didn't want to forget them." Emmett traced the rim of her cup with one finger, quiet for a long moment. "I don't have graves to visit. Just places I try not to remember." Pearl watched her, the line of her jaw, the steady set of her shoulders. "You don't have to be rootless anymore." Emmett looked up. "You saying I've got a place here?" Pearl nodded once. "I'm saying you already made one." That night, as they sat before the fire, Emmett unwrapped a small bundle of cloth she'd kept tucked in the bottom corner of her satchel. Inside was a brass button, dulled with age, and a piece of locket chain. "My mother wore this," she said, holding the chain up so the fire caught the faintest glint. "She gave it to me before the fever took her. I've never shown it to anyone." Pearl took it carefully, turning it in her palm. "It's beautiful." Emmett met her gaze. "So's this." Pearl looked back at her, the firelight soft against Emmett's cheek, her eyes steady and open. She didn't have to ask what she meant. They lay close that night, facing one another beneath the quilt, their hands joined between them. No storm outside, no words between. Just warmth and breath, and the knowledge that neither of them would have to go on alone again. And come morning, when the sun rose pale over the snow and the frost clung to every fence post, Emmett was still there. Not as a guest, not as a question, but as a choice made and kept. The sun rose pale and clean over the snow-covered basin, casting long slants of light through the kitchen window. Inside, Pearl stood at the table rolling out dough with the old pine pin her mother had carved decades ago. The dough was stubborn and cold, but she worked it smooth with practiced hands. Emmett was beside her, wrapping cured venison in cloth for the cellar. They moved around each other with quiet ease, no wasted words or gestures. The new year had come and gone without ceremony, just 2 cups of coffee by the fire and the sound of wind threading through the eaves. January brought stillness, the kind that settled deep. They'd spent those weeks mending what needed mending: boots, fence posts, their own hearts, though neither of them said as much. "You ever think about getting chickens again?" Emmett asked, closing up the cellar hatch. Pearl dusted flour off her hands. "Not since the fox got the last ones, but I might now." Emmett leaned against the counter. "We could build a proper coop come spring, something tight-fitted with a stone base." Pearl tilted her head. "You planning to be here in the spring?" "I'm planning to be here for all of it," Emmett said. "If you'll have me." Pearl didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. "You already know the answer." They ate warm bread and smoked meat by the fire, and afterward Pearl brought out a bundle wrapped in muslin. She set it on the table between them and untied the string. Inside was a narrow wooden box, weathered but well kept. She opened it slowly. A set of carving tools lay nestled in cloth-thin blades, a curved chisel, a worn-handled baron. Emmett's brow creased. "Belonged to Will," Pearl said. "He carved the cradle for our boy with these. The legs on the rocker never sat even, but it held steady." Emmett reached out, brushing a finger over the smallest blade. "You sure? I want you to have them," Pearl said. "You've got a way with your hands." "I've seen it." Emmett looked up, throat working before she spoke. "I'll make something that lasts." They spent the next weeks in small work, mending harnesses, whittling handles, boiling down tallow for candles. Emmett took to carving in the evenings, quiet and focused by the hearth. At first it was small things: a spoon handle, the edge of a drawer pull, but soon she turned to something larger, and Pearl found herself watching the shape of it come into being. One afternoon, Emmett asked her to help haul a heavy tarp from the shed. She wouldn't say what it was for, only that she needed the space clear. Pearl didn't press. She knew the shape of patience. By mid-February, the light had changed: longer days, clearer skies, hints of thaw along the southern slope. Pearl was trimming dead branches from the apple tree when Emmett came to the porch, a long bundle wrapped in an oilcloth slung under one arm. "I want to show you something," she said. Pearl wiped her hands and followed. Inside, Emmett unwrapped the bundle slowly. It was a cradle, solid, clean-lined, carved with pine boughs along the side rails. The wood was darkened with oil, the rockers curved smooth. Pearl came close, running her hand over the carved edge. "I tried to keep it simple," Emmett said, "but I wanted it to be strong." Pearl's voice was low. "It is. I know we can't bring back what we lost," Emmett said, "but we can build what comes next." Pearl turned to her. "Are you saying you want children?" "I'm saying I want whatever life waits for us," Emmett said. "If that's just the 2 of us in this cabin until we're old and gray, I'll be more than content. But if we ever decide to raise a child, one who needs a home, or one we make ourselves, then I want to be ready." Pearl stepped closer, her hand finding Emmett's. "I never thought I'd love again." "Not like this." Emmett's voice was steady. "Then let's not waste it." They married that March. Just the 2 of them, standing in the grove behind the house with the first green shoots breaking through the last of the snow. Pearl wore a blue shawl she'd woven herself. Emmett carved 2 rings from juniper and lined them in silver. No preacher, no papers, just vows spoken quiet and sure, witnessed by the land that had carried them this far. That spring they built the coop together, stone-footed and tight as promised. They took in a girl from a family passing west, her parents lost to fever, her uncle too old to raise her. Her name was Lida, and she was 9, all elbows and fierce eyes. Pearl taught her to bake, and Emmett showed her how to hold a knife and respect it. The cradle sat by the hearth for years, holding dolls and kittens, and later, a boy with Pearl's eyes and Emmett's dark hair. The cabin grew one room added, then another. The apple tree bore fruit again, and Emmett carved their names into the porch rail, just beneath the place Pearl rested her hand when she watched the sun rise. They grew older. Their hands grew rougher. But each morning, Pearl still reached for Emmett, and each night, Emmett still laid her tools down and came home to the fire. And when the world turned quiet again, when the children were grown and the snow fell soft and slow, they sat beside each other in the warmth they'd built, fingers laced, hearts steady, together always.